Margaret pressed her palm against the cold glass, leaving a ghostly handprint that seemed to mock the impossibility before her. 23 years of forensic work had taught her to trust evidence over emotion, but the DNA printouts scattered across the metal table behind her defied every principle she'd built her career upon. The youngest boy, Peter, was humming, a tuneless little melody that drifted through the observation room's speaker system, the same song his mother claimed he'd been humming the morning he disappeared. Margaret had interviewed Sarah Haddar 3 hours ago, watching the woman's face cycle through disbelief, joy, and a terror so profound it had made Margaret's own chest tighten with recognition. "They remember everything," Sarah had whispered, clutching a tissue stained with mascara. "Every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every family joke. But they don't understand why we look different." Peter asked me why I had lines around my eyes. Margaret turned from the window and picked up the genetic sequencing report, though she'd already memorized every anomalous marker. The boy's DNA contained protein structures that didn't exist in any database, cellular markers that suggested genetic manipulation, decades ahead of current technology. In 1987, gene therapy was still science fiction. In 1975, when the boys had vanished, it was barely a fever dream in the minds of the most ambitious researchers. Yet here was evidence of genetic alteration so sophisticated it made her department's equipment look like stone tools. The door behind her opened with a pneumatic hiss. Detective Ray Morrison stepped inside, bringing the smell of coffee and cigarettes. Margaret had worked with dozens of law enforcement officers over the years, but Morrison possessed a rare quality. He understood that some cases required more than standard procedure. "The parents are asking to take them home," Morrison said, settling his considerable frame into one of the plastic chairs. "Can't say I blame them. 12 years is a long time to wait." Margaret didn't turn around. Through the glass she watched Tommy Haddar, the eldest at 12, though he'd been 12 for over a decade now, as he helped his younger brother tie a shoelace that had come undone. Such an ordinary gesture, yet it sent ice through her veins. The children moved with the unconscious ease of siblings who'd never been separated, never experienced the trauma of loss or the disorientation of temporal displacement. "We can't release them yet," she said. "Not until we understand what happened to them. What happened is they came home." Morrison's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too much strangeness in the past 48 hours. "Sometimes that's enough." Margaret finally faced him, the DNA report still clutched in her hands. "Ray, look at this data. Really look at it. These children have been genetically modified in ways that shouldn't be possible. Someone or something altered their fundamental biological structure." Morrison's expression hardened. "You saying these aren't the Haddar boys?" The question hung between them like smoke from Morrison's ever-present cigarettes. Margaret had been asking herself the same thing since the results came back from the lab. The boys possessed the memories, personalities, and genetic markers of the missing children, but the anomalous sequences suggested something far more complex than simple disappearance and return. "I'm saying we need to find out where they've been," Margaret replied, "and who had the technology to do this to them." She moved to the evidence board Morrison had set up, studying the timeline he'd constructed from witness statements and police reports. The boys had vanished while playing in the woods behind their house, a dense stretch of Douglas fir and coastal scrub that locals called the Whisper Pines. Search teams had combed every inch of those woods for months, finding nothing. Then yesterday, a jogger had spotted 3 children walking out of the same forest, wearing clothes that should have rotted away years ago. "The parents identified them immediately," Morrison said, following her gaze. No hesitation, no doubt. Sarah Haddar knew the scar on Michael's chin from when he fell off his bike. Frank recognized Tommy's habit of chewing his left thumbnail when he's nervous. Margaret nodded, but her attention had shifted to a notation in the corner of Morrison's timeline. "What's this about other disappearances?" Morrison's pause lasted a beat too long. "Old cases, probably unrelated." "How old?" "Scattered reports going back to the 50s. Kids vanishing in those woods, never found." Morrison stood, suddenly restless. "Look, Doc, I've lived in Crescent Bay my whole life. These woods have always had a reputation, but that's just local folklore, not evidence." Margaret studied his face, recognizing the careful neutrality of a man withholding information. In her experience, folklore often contained kernels of truth that science eventually validated. "I want to see those files." "Margaret, all of them, Ray. If we're dealing with a pattern, I need to understand it." Through the glass, Peter Haddar had stopped humming. The boy sat perfectly still now, staring directly at the one-way mirror as if he could see through it. His eyes held an unsettling intelligence, ancient and patient, that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. For just a moment she could swear he was looking right at her. Margaret forced herself to look away from Peter's unblinking stare, her pulse hammering against her throat. The boy couldn't actually see through the one-way glass. It was scientifically impossible, but something in his expression made her skin crawl with the sensation of being studied, catalogued, measured. "I'll get you those files," Morrison said quietly, and she realized he'd been watching her reaction. "But Margaret, promise me you won't let this case consume you like..." "Like what, Ray?" She turned to face him, defensive walls snapping into place with practiced efficiency. Morrison's weathered face softened with something dangerously close to pity. "Like the others, you've been chasing ghosts for 15 years, and every missing child case pulls you deeper into that hole. I've seen it happen before." Margaret's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what Morrison meant, though neither of them would speak the name that hung between them like a blade. David, her son. 7 years old when he'd vanished from a playground in Sacramento while she'd been testifying in court about another family's tragedy. The irony had nearly destroyed her. A forensic geneticist who specialized in identifying victims, unable to find her own child. "This is different," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "We have evidence here, actual genetic data." "Do we?" Morrison pulled out a cigarette, then seemed to remember they were in a government building and tucked it behind his ear instead. "Or do we have 3 traumatized kids who need their parents, not more prodding from scientists?" Through the speaker, she could hear Tommy Haddar asking Michael about a toy airplane he'd left in his room. The casual normalcy of it, a boy wondering about a possession from 12 years ago, as if he'd merely been away for a weekend, sent another chill down Margaret's spine. Her pager buzzed against her hip. The display showed her lab's number followed by 911. Margaret's stomach dropped. In 15 years of forensic work, emergency pages from her lab had never brought good news. "I need to make a call," she said, already moving toward the door. The hallway outside smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee. Margaret found a payphone near the building's entrance and fed it quarters with hands that trembled slightly. The lab picked up on the first ring. "Dr. Sinclair?" Her lab assistant's voice was tight with strain. "We've got a problem with the Haddar samples. The anomalous sequences, they're not stable." Margaret gripped the phone harder. "What do you mean, not stable?" "The protein structures we identified yesterday, they're breaking down rapidly. It's like they're reverting to normal human DNA, but that should be impossible. Genetic material doesn't just change." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. In her apartment back in Portland, a shrine of newspaper clippings and police reports covered one wall. Every missing child case she'd consulted on in the past decade and a half. David's school photos sat in the center, a 7-year-old boy with her dark hair and his father's stubborn chin, forever frozen in time. She'd moved to Oregon 5 years ago, drawn by the hope that a change of scenery might quiet the ghosts. Instead, she'd thrown herself deeper into her work, accepting every case that involved missing children. Her supervisor had suggested therapy. Her ex-husband had suggested she was having a breakdown. Margaret preferred to think of it as maintaining hope. "Run the tests again," she told her assistant, "and pull fresh samples from the boys if you can. I want confirmation before..." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the receiver, then at the dial tone that buzzed like an angry insect. She fed more quarters into the phone and tried again, but got only a busy signal. Then another. On the third attempt, a recorded message informed her that the number was temporarily out of service. Impossible. Her lab had multiple phone lines, backup systems, redundancies built into every protocol. Margaret's chest tightened, with the familiar sensation of a case spiraling beyond her control. She walked back toward the observation room, her mind racing through possibilities. Genetic degradation wasn't unheard of in old samples, but these were fresh, and the rate of change her assistant had described suggested something actively altering the DNA structure, not simple cellular breakdown. Morrison was waiting for her in the hallway, a manila folder tucked under his arm. His expression told her he'd noticed her pale complexion. "Bad news?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet." Margaret gestured to the folder. "The historical cases?" 19 incidents, dating back to 1953. All children between 6 and 14. All disappeared in or around the Whisper Pines forest. Morrison's voice carried a heaviness that suggested he'd been dreading this conversation. "Margaret, there's something else, something I didn't mention before." She waited, though part of her wanted to walk away, to drive back to Portland and pretend she'd never heard of Crescent Bay or the Haddar family. "The children who disappeared," Morrison continued, "they all shared certain characteristics. Dark hair, specific blood types, above-average intelligence." He paused, studying her face. "They all looked remarkably similar to your boy David." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She reached for the wall, needing something solid beneath her fingertips as the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker and dim. Morrison's voice continued, but it sounded distant now, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "How do you know what David looked like?" she whispered. Morrison's expression grew uncomfortable. "Margaret, when the FBI brought you in on this case, they sent your file ahead. Standard procedure. But when I saw the photo of your son..." He opened the manila folder and withdrew a black-and-white photograph, 8 by 10, showing a group of children at what appeared to be a school function. This was taken in 1952, before the first disappearance. Margaret stared at the image. 7 children stood in a neat row, all with the same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes, the same stubborn set to their chins. They could have been siblings. They could have been David. "Where did you get this?" Her voice barely registered above a whisper. "It was in the police files, tucked away in evidence storage. No one thought to connect it to anything until yesterday." Morrison's cigarette had somehow found its way to his lips, unlit but present. "Margaret, I think someone's been watching these woods for a very long time, waiting for specific children." The manila folder slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, scattering photographs and reports across the linoleum floor. Images of missing children, police reports, witness statements, a decades-long catalogue of loss that suddenly felt personal in a way that made her stomach lurch. One photograph caught her attention as it settled near her feet. A young girl, perhaps 9 years old, with Margaret's own dark hair and serious expression. The date stamp read August 1974, just 1 year before the Haddar boys vanished. "Emma Chen," Morrison said, following her gaze, "went missing while camping with her family near the forest edge, never found." He paused. "She would have been your age if she'd lived." Margaret knelt to gather the scattered papers, her hands moving automatically while her mind reeled. The connection was impossible, statistically meaningless. Thousands of children went missing every year. Dark hair and intelligence weren't rare traits, but as she shuffled through report after report, the pattern became undeniable. Not just similar characteristics, nearly identical facial structures, bone density measurements, even dental formation patterns that suggested a genetic commonality that shouldn't exist in unrelated children. "Ray," she said slowly, "these children weren't random targets. Someone was selecting them. But why?" Before Morrison could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the observation room. Shouting voices, the scrape of chairs against linoleum, and underneath it all, a sound that made Margaret's blood freeze. Children laughing. They ran down the hallway, Margaret's low heels clicking against the floor like a countdown timer. Through the observation window, she could see that the Haddar boys were no longer sitting quietly at their table. Instead, they stood in perfect formation near the far wall, their faces turned upward toward something Margaret couldn't see. Tommy, the eldest, was speaking in a voice too steady for a 12-year-old child. "She's here now," he said. "The one who remembers." Dr. Patricia Reeves, the child psychiatrist who'd been conducting interviews, pressed herself against the corner of the room, her professional composure shattered. "They just stopped," she gasped, as Morrison and Margaret entered the adjacent hallway. In the middle of a sentence, they all stopped talking and moved to that wall. "They've been standing there for 5 minutes, perfectly still." Margaret moved to the one-way glass, her reflection ghosting over the scene beyond. The boys hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked, but now she could see what had captured their attention, a small ventilation grate near the ceiling, its metal slats casting geometric shadows across the white wall. "Tommy?" she called through the intercom. "Can you hear me?" All 3 boys turned toward the mirror in perfect unison, their movements synchronized like dancers responding to music only they could hear. Peter, the youngest, smiled with an expression far too knowing for an 8-year-old child. "We've been waiting for you, Dr. Sinclair," he said, in a voice that carried none of the uncertainty of childhood. "We know what happened to your David." The room tilted sideways. Margaret gripped the edge of the observation desk, her knuckles white against the metal surface. Morrison was speaking, Dr. Reeves was speaking, but their voices seemed to come from another world entirely. "What did you say?" Margaret whispered into the intercom. Michael stepped forward, his 10-year-old face serene and ancient. "The others are still there, in the place between. But we came back to find you, because you're the only one who can choose." "Choose what?" Tommy's 12-year-old voice carried the weight of prophecy, whether to let the past stay buried, or follow us back to where the missing children wait. Margaret stared at the 3 impossible boys, her scientific mind warring with a mother's desperate hope. Behind her, Morrison was calling for backup, for specialists, for someone to make sense of what they were witnessing. But Margaret understood with crystalline clarity that she stood at a crossroads between everything she'd believed about reality and a truth that might destroy her. The choice was hers. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached toward the intercom button, then stopped. The weight of 15 years crashed down on her. 15 years of searching, of following leads that led nowhere, of building walls around her heart, only to have cases like this tear them down again. "Dr. Sinclair?" Dr. Reeves's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" No, she wasn't all right. She hadn't been all right since the day she'd come home from court to find David's bicycle still in the driveway and his bedroom empty. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned her a doctorate in forensic genetics, that had solved hundreds of cases with methodical precision, screamed warnings about what was happening here. These children couldn't know about David. They couldn't know anything about her personal life unless someone had told them, unless this was all an elaborate hoax designed to exploit her grief. But the way they'd moved in unison, the impossible synchronization of their words and gestures, the DNA evidence that defied every law of biology she understood. "We need to clear the room," Morrison said, his hand already reaching for his radio. "Get the parents in here. Let them take their kids home. Whatever this is, it's not our jurisdiction anymore." "No." The word escaped Margaret's lips with more force than she'd intended. Through the glass, the 3 boys watched her with patient expressions, as if they had all the time in the world to wait for her decision. "Not yet." Morrison's weathered face creased with concern. "Margaret, listen to yourself. These kids are playing games with information they shouldn't have access to. Someone coached them, fed them details about your personal life to manipulate you. Don't let them succeed." But even as he spoke the words, Margaret could see the doubt in Morrison's eyes. He'd witnessed the same impossible synchronicity, the same unsettling knowledge that seemed to flow between the brothers without spoken communication. This wasn't coaching. This was something else entirely. Margaret closed her eyes and saw David's face as clearly as if he were standing beside her. 7 years old forever, frozen in school photographs and birthday videos, in the shrine of memories she'd built in her apartment. For 15 years she'd told herself that accepting his death would be giving up, that somewhere, somehow, he was waiting for her to find him. Now these 3 children, if they were children, claimed to know where he was, claimed that others were waiting in the place between, whatever that meant. The scientist in her rejected the possibility as fantasy, delusion, or deliberate deception. But the mother in her, the part that had never stopped listening for David's voice in crowded places, whispered that this might be her only chance. "Dr. Sinclair?" Tommy's voice drifted through the intercom speaker, gentle but insistent. "The door is closing. Every moment you hesitate, the path becomes harder to follow." Margaret opened her eyes to find all 3 boys pressed against the observation window, their small hands flat against the glass. Their breath should have fogged the surface, but it remained perfectly clear, as if they existed in a space that didn't quite touch the physical world around them. "What happens if I choose wrong?" she whispered into the intercom. Peter's 8-year-old face tilted with an expression of infinite sadness. "There is no wrong choice, Dr. Sinclair. Only the choice to know, or the choice to remain safe in not knowing." Safe. Margaret almost laughed at the word. She hadn't felt safe since the day David disappeared. She'd built a career on identification and closure, on providing answers to other families that she'd never been able to find for herself. But safety? Safety was an illusion she'd abandoned in a Sacramento courthouse parking lot when she'd realized that her son was gone, and no amount of scientific knowledge could bring him back. Behind her, Morrison was arguing with someone on his radio, his voice tight with frustration. Dr. Reeves had retreated to the far corner of the observation room, clutching her clipboard like a shield. The normal world, the world of procedures and protocols, of rational explanations and bureaucratic solutions, felt suddenly fragile, as if it might shatter at the slightest touch. Margaret's pager buzzed again against her hip, but she didn't check it. Her lab assistant's call had been cut off, her phone lines mysteriously severed. Coincidence? Or was someone trying to isolate her, to force this choice without the safety net of scientific backup and verification? The boys remained motionless against the glass, their dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They looked so much like David, not just the physical resemblance Morrison had noted, but something deeper, a quality of stillness, of waiting, that she remembered from long nights when her son would slip into her bedroom after a nightmare and stand beside her bed until she woke. "I need time," she said into the intercom, hating how small her voice sounded. Tommy shook his head slowly. "Time is what we no longer have, Dr. Sinclair. The others have been waiting so long already, much longer than we promised them." Margaret stared at the 3 faces pressed against the glass, and something inside her chest cracked open like an egg. 15 years of careful control, of professional distance, of telling herself that hope was just another form of self-torture, all of it crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "What do I have to do?" The words left her mouth before her rational mind could stop them. Morrison's hand clamped down on her shoulder. "Margaret, no. Whatever game these kids are playing, don't give them what they want. Walk away. We'll find another expert, someone who—" "Someone who what?" Margaret shrugged off his grip, her voice rising with each word. "Someone who didn't lose a child? Someone who can remain objective while children claim they know where the missing go?" She turned to face Morrison, and she could see her own desperation reflected in his horrified expression. "Ray, what if they're telling the truth?" "Truth?" Morrison's weathered face flushed red. "The truth is that 3 kids walked out of the woods after 12 years without aging a day. The truth is that their DNA contains sequences that shouldn't exist. The truth is that someone or something is playing games with us, and you're about to walk right into their trap." Through the intercom, Tommy's voice cut through their argument like a blade. "She's not walking into a trap, Detective Morrison. She's walking home." The word hit Margaret with physical force. Home. She hadn't felt at home anywhere since David disappeared. Her apartment in Portland was a museum of grief, her laboratory a fortress of facts that couldn't comfort her in the dark hours before dawn. But standing here, looking at these impossible children who claimed to know her son's fate, she felt something she'd almost forgotten, the pull of belonging somewhere. "How?" she asked, stepping closer to the intercom. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Reeves whispering urgently into her phone, probably calling for supervisors or security, or someone with the authority to stop what was about to happen. "How do I follow you?" Michael pressed his face closer to the glass, his 10-year-old features serious and ancient. "You have to choose to see what's really been happening here. Not just the science, not just the facts, the pattern underneath." Margaret's mind raced through the files Morrison had shown her. Decades of missing children, all bearing the same impossible resemblance to each other and to David. The genetic anomalies in the Haddar boys' DNA, the way they moved and spoke with eerie synchronization. Her severed communication with the lab, the timing of their return, the way they'd known details about her life they couldn't possibly possess. "The facility," she whispered, pieces clicking together with terrifying clarity. "Morrison mentioned a research facility that officially doesn't exist. That's where you came from, isn't it? That's where the others are." Peter nodded solemnly, his 8-year-old face grave. Some came willingly when they understood what was being offered. Others. He trailed off, but Margaret could fill in the blanks. Others were taken. Morrison grabbed her arm again, his fingers digging into her jacket sleeve. "Margaret, listen to yourself. You're talking about following 3 possibly delusional children into God knows what based on nothing but wishful thinking and grief. This is how people disappear. This is how we end up with 4 missing persons instead of 3 returned ones." But Margaret was already moving toward the door that connected the observation room to the interview chamber. Morrison's protests, Dr. Reeves's frantic phone calls, the blare of alarms that had started sounding somewhere in the building, all of it faded into background noise. The only thing that mattered was the choice spreading out before her like a chasm she could either cross or spend the rest of her life staring into. The handle turned easily under her palm, too easily, as if locks and security protocols had become irrelevant. The 3 boys stepped back from the glass as she entered, arranging themselves in that same perfect formation she'd witnessed before. "Dr. Sinclair." Tommy's voice carried relief and something that might have been joy. "You chose to cross over." The room felt different from this side of the glass, larger somehow, as if the walls had stretched to accommodate impossible spaces. Margaret could hear Morrison pounding on the door behind her, but when she glanced back, the observation window showed only her own reflection multiplied in an endless series of mirrors. "I haven't chosen anything yet," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Simply by walking through that door, by stepping into the space the boys occupied, she'd already crossed a line she might never be able to recross. Michael held out his small hand, palm up. "The path to where the children wait isn't something you can walk alone, Dr. Sinclair. You have to let us show you." Margaret looked down at the offered hand, pale, unmarked by time or experience, belonging to a child who should have grown into a young man by now. Beyond the mirrors that had replaced the observation window, she could no longer see Morrison or Dr. Reeves or the familiar world of procedures and protocols. There was only forward now, only the unknown. Margaret reached out and took the child's hand. The moment Margaret's fingers touched Michael's palm, the world shifted. Not violently, more like stepping from one room into another, except the rooms existed in entirely different realities. The sterile interview chamber dissolved around them, its white walls bleeding away like watercolors in rain. The fluorescent lights dimmed to something softer, more organic, as if filtered through leaves or water. Margaret's first instinct was to pull back, to retreat into the familiar world of facts and evidence. But Michael's small hand held hers with surprising strength, and she found herself moving forward into a space that defied every law of physics she understood. They were walking through a corridor that shouldn't exist, too long for the building they'd started in, too high for any structure she'd seen in Crescent Bay. The walls seemed to be made of something between stone and living tissue, pulsing gently with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, but the fixtures looked decades old, as if this place had been abandoned long before the boys had ever disappeared. "What is this place?" Margaret whispered, afraid to speak too loudly in the strange acoustics of the tunnel. "Part of what they built," Tommy answered, his 12-year-old voice echoing strangely. "The facility you were looking for. It exists between spaces now, between what was and what could be." Peter skipped ahead, his movements unnaturally light. They thought they could improve us, make us better, stronger, but they didn't understand what they were really doing. As they walked deeper into the impossible corridor, Margaret began to notice details that made her scientific mind revolt. Doors set into the walls at irregular intervals, each marked with numbers that followed no logical sequence. 7, 23, 101, 2. Behind some doors, she could hear sounds, children's laughter, someone crying, the mechanical hum of equipment that should have been shut down decades ago. "The others are behind those doors?" she asked. "Some of them." Michael's grip on her hand tightened. "The ones who haven't decided yet whether to move forward or stay where they are." They paused in front of a door marked with a simple 15, the number of years since David had vanished. Margaret reached toward the handle with her free hand, but Tommy caught her wrist. "Not yet," he said gently. "You need to understand the rules first. What they offered us, what we became, what you might have to become to reach him." The corridor opened into a vast chamber that defied architectural possibility. The ceilings stretched up into darkness, supported by columns that twisted like DNA helixes. Banks of computers lined the walls, equipment that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced, covered in dust but still humming with electrical life. And scattered throughout the space were children. Not real children. Margaret's trained eye could see that immediately. These were something else, something that wore the shapes of children like carefully crafted masks. They moved through the space with the same eerie synchronization she'd witnessed in the Haddar boys, tending to the computers, monitoring screens that displayed data in languages Margaret didn't recognize. "The successful ones," Peter explained, noticing her horrified stare, "the children who adapted to what they became, who accepted the changes." Margaret forced herself to study the scene with scientific detachment, cataloguing details even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The children all shared similar features: dark hair, intelligent eyes, bone structure that echoed David's face in dozens of variations. They looked healthy, content even, but there was something fundamentally wrong in the way they moved, as if they'd forgotten how to be truly human. "And the unsuccessful ones?" she managed to ask. Michael led her to a bank of monitors displaying vital signs, genetic sequences, brain activity patterns. Names scrolled past in green text: Emma Chen, Rodriguez, David Sinclair, Hayes, Jennifer Wu, dozens of names spanning decades. "They're still in the transformation chambers," Tommy said softly. "Still choosing, still becoming. Time works differently there. They could emerge tomorrow or in another 20 years. The process can't be rushed." Margaret stared at the screen showing David's name, his vital signs steady and strong after 15 years. Alive, changing into something she might not recognize, but alive. A new figure emerged from the shadows between the computer banks. A woman in a lab coat that had once been white, but now carried the stains of decades. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to the faded name tag, though her face looked impossibly young for someone who should have been in her 70s. "Dr. Sinclair," the woman said, her voice carrying the same eerie timelessness as the children. "We've been waiting for you to arrive. Your genetic profile has unique compatibility markers, like your son's. The process would be gentler for you than most." Margaret finally understood the true choice before her. Not just whether to find David, but whether to become something other than human to do it. Whether love was worth the cost of losing herself entirely. The children watched her with patient, ancient eyes, waiting for her decision. Margaret stood frozen among the impossible architecture and transformed children, her mind reeling between scientific skepticism and maternal desperation. Dr. Chen approached slowly, her lab coat rustling like autumn leaves, and Margaret caught the acrid scent of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. "You're afraid," Dr. Chen observed, stopping just out of reach. "Good. Fear means you understand the magnitude of what we're offering." "What you're offering?" Margaret's voice cracked. "You're talking about abandoning my humanity to chase a ghost. David could be dead in there, transformed into something I wouldn't even recognize as my son." Tommy stepped forward, his 12-year-old face grave with ancient knowledge. "Dr. Sinclair, your son isn't dead, but he isn't the same either. None of us are. The question is whether you love him enough to meet him where he is now." Margaret's gaze swept across the children tending their incomprehensible machines. Each face held echoes of David's features, as if they'd all been carved from the same genetic template and refined through countless iterations. The successful ones, Peter had called them. But successful at what? Becoming better humans or better approximations of something that had never been human at all? "Show me the process," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "If you want me to make this choice, I need to understand exactly what you're asking me to become." Dr. Chen's too young face brightened with something like relief. She gestured toward a section of the vast chamber where cylindrical glass tanks rose from the floor like technological trees. Inside each tank, Margaret could see shadows, forms suspended in viscous fluid connected to tubes and wires that pulsed with bioluminescent light. "The transformation chambers," Dr. Chen explained as they walked. "We began this work in the 1960s, trying to enhance human genetic potential. The military wanted stronger soldiers. The medical establishment wanted to eliminate hereditary disease. We thought we could improve on nature's design." Margaret peered into the nearest tank and felt her heart stop. The figure inside was recognizably human but wrong in subtle ways. Limbs too long, fingers that ended in something between nails and talons, skin that shifted color like a chameleon's. The face was peaceful, almost beatific, but the eyes behind closed lids moved too rapidly, as if processing thoughts at superhuman speed. "Enhanced cognitive function," Dr. Chen continued, noting Margaret's horrified fascination. "Improved physical capabilities, resistance to aging, disease, psychological trauma. But the process requires complete genetic restructuring. What emerges isn't quite what went in." "And David?" Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. Michael appeared beside her, his small hand reaching for the tank's control panel. "Would you like to see him?" Margaret's scientific training screamed warnings. This was manipulation, exploitation of her grief, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to break down her rational defenses. But 15 years of sleepless nights and unanswered questions had worn away her resistance to hope. She nodded. The tank's opacity shifted, the fluid clearing to reveal the figure suspended within. Margaret's knees buckled. It was David, unmistakably her son, despite the impossible passage of time. He'd grown taller, his child's face maturing into adolescent features she'd imagined 1,000 times. But his skin held an otherworldly luminescence, and when his eyes opened to meet hers through the glass, they held depths that no human gaze should contain. "He's been waiting," Tommy said softly. "They all have. But the choice to complete the transformation has to come from within. We can't force the final step." Margaret pressed her palm against the tank's surface, tears streaming down her face. David's mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear through the fluid and glass. But she could read his lips, the same words he'd whispered every night when she tucked him into bed. "I love you, Mom." "What happens to the ones who refuse to complete the transformation?" she asked, not taking her eyes off David's face. Dr. Chen's expression darkened. "They remain suspended between states, human enough to suffer but changed enough to survive indefinitely. It's not death, but it's not truly life either." The weight of the choice settled on Margaret's shoulders like a physical burden. Enter the transformation herself, and potentially become something unrecognizable, or leave David trapped in an endless limbo between human and other. The Haddar boys watched her with patient understanding, having faced the same impossible decision years ago. Margaret's phone, still somehow receiving signal in this impossible place, buzzed with a text from Morrison. "Margaret, where are you? The building is empty. No sign of you or the boys." The outside world felt suddenly remote, almost fictional. Morrison's reality of procedures and protocols, of rational explanations and bureaucratic solutions, couldn't touch what was happening here. This choice existed beyond the reach of normal human experience. "How long do I have to decide?" Margaret asked. Dr. Chen checked a device on her wrist, some hybrid of watch and medical monitor. The window of compatibility closes at dawn. After that, the process becomes significantly more dangerous. Margaret looked at David's face one more time, then turned to face her impossible future. Margaret stared into David's luminous eyes through the transformation chamber's glass, feeling the weight of 15 years collapse into this single moment. The choice before her wasn't just about reunion. It was about surrendering everything she'd ever been to become something she couldn't comprehend. "I need to understand what I'm choosing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Show me everything, no more revelations, no more gradual truths. If you want me to step into that chamber, I need to know exactly what happens to my humanity." Dr. Chen nodded, leading her to a bank of monitors displaying genetic sequences that writhed and shifted like living things. The process begins with cellular restructuring at the molecular level. Your DNA becomes flexible, adaptive. It learns to incorporate beneficial traits from other organisms. Margaret studied the scrolling data with her trained geneticist's eye, recognizing human base pairs twisted together with sequences she'd never encountered. Other organisms? What kind of other organisms? "Whatever provides the necessary enhancements," Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Deep-sea creatures for pressure resistance, certain reptiles for regenerative capabilities, Arctic mammals for temperature adaptation. The children you see here represent decades of refinement in the integration process." The clinical language couldn't mask the horror of what she was describing. Margaret watched the transformed children moving through their tasks with inhuman coordination and suddenly understood why their eyes held such ancient knowledge. They weren't just enhanced humans. They were genetic composites, living libraries of traits harvested from across the evolutionary spectrum. "And David chose this willingly?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer would destroy her. Tommy's young face crumpled with something approaching guilt. "He didn't choose to be taken initially. None of us did. But when the process began, when we started to understand what we could become," he gestured helplessly at the vast chamber around them. "The enhanced cognitive function makes you see possibilities beyond normal human comprehension. David saw the patterns we could create together, the problems we could solve." "You're talking about a hive mind," Margaret whispered, the pieces finally clicking together. The synchronization, the shared knowledge, the way the Haddar boys had spoken in perfect coordination. "You're not individuals anymore. You're components of something larger." Michael stepped closer, his child's hand impossibly warm against her arm. "Not a hive mind exactly. More like a family that shares thoughts instead of just genes. David has been waiting for you because the connection isn't complete without you. You're the missing piece that would allow him to fully integrate." The magnitude of the manipulation hit Margaret like a physical blow. They hadn't just taken her son, they'd designed his transformation to require her participation. David's suspended state wasn't an accident or a failure of the process. It was bait, carefully constructed to ensure she'd face exactly this choice. "You bastards," she breathed, fury rising through her grief. "You turned my child into a trap. 15 years of agony, 15 years of not knowing if he was alive or dead, and it was all to bring me here." Dr. Chen's expression remained clinically neutral. The emotional bond between parent and child creates unique genetic resonances. Your DNA carries complementary sequences to David's enhanced pattern. Together, you would represent a breakthrough in our research, a stable family unit that could reproduce and expand the enhanced population. Margaret looked back at David's peaceful face in the transformation chamber, seeing now the terrible patience in his features. How long had he been aware? How long had he been waiting in that fluid prison, knowing his mother would eventually be drawn into the same web that had captured him? Her phone buzzed again, Morrison's increasingly frantic messages creating a lifeline to the world she'd known. A world where children weren't genetic experiments, where love wasn't weaponized as a recruitment tool, where the boundaries of human identity still meant something. But David's lips moved again through the fluid, forming those same 3 words, "I love you, Mom." And Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that her choice had been made the moment he'd first said those words as a 5-year-old child, not here, not in this impossible place, but in all the thousands of small moments that had built the architecture of their relationship. She thought of Morrison pounding on doors above, searching empty buildings for traces of her disappearance. She thought of her laboratory in Portland, sterile and rational, and utterly inadequate for comprehending what love could drive a person to do. She thought of 15 years of anniversaries and birthdays marked alone, of Christmas presents bought and never given, of a future that had stopped making sense the day David vanished. "The window closes at dawn," Dr. Chen reminded her, checking her device again. 3 hours and 17 minutes. Margaret pressed both palms against David's transformation chamber, feeling the glass vibrate with the machine's rhythms. Her reflection stared back at her, a 52-year-old woman who had aged 15 years while her son remained suspended in artificial time. "If I do this," she said quietly, "there's no going back. No returning to who I was." "No," Dr. Chen confirmed. "But there would be no more waiting either, no more wondering, no more grief." Margaret closed her eyes and made her choice. Margaret's hand moved toward the chamber's access panel, her fingers trembling as they approached the biometric scanner that would begin her transformation. But as the red light flickered on, waiting for her palm print, the vast chamber suddenly plunged into emergency lighting, harsh red strobes that painted everything in hellish shadows. Alarms shrieked through the underground facility. The transformed children stopped their coordinated movements, their luminous eyes turning toward the ceiling in perfect unison. Dr. Chen's composed mask cracked as she rushed to a bank of monitors now flashing urgent warnings. "What's happening?" Margaret demanded, pulling her hand back from the scanner. "Surface breach," Dr. Chen said, her fingers flying over controls that sparked and failed. "Federal agents. They found the main entrance." Through the cacophony of alarms, Margaret heard her phone ringing. Morrison's name flashed on the screen. With shaking hands, she answered. "Margaret, thank God." Morrison's voice crackled through static. "We've got FBI tactical teams surrounding the research facility. Get out of there now. Whatever they're doing down there, it's not legal and it's not safe." "You don't understand," Margaret whispered, looking at David's chamber as the life support systems flickered. "David is here. He's alive, Morrison. I can't leave him again." "The building is rigged to self-destruct," Morrison shouted over the sound of boots and commands in the background. "We found the demolition charges. You have maybe 10 minutes before—" The line went dead as the facility's power grid failed entirely. Emergency batteries kicked in, but only for essential systems. Margaret watched in horror as David's transformation chamber began powering down, the life-sustaining fluid starting to drain. "No." She slammed her palms against the glass. "Fix it! Keep him alive!" Dr. Chen was frantically typing commands into a failing terminal. "The surface systems are compromised. I can't maintain power to the individual chambers." The other children moved with eerie calm through the chaos, their enhanced coordination allowing them to navigate in the strobing darkness. Tommy appeared at Margaret's side, his young face grave with ancient wisdom. "Dr. Sinclair," he said quietly, "the emergency protocols will preserve the most advanced subjects first. David's transformation is incomplete. He'll be among the last to receive life support." Margaret watched the fluid level in David's chamber drop steadily. His enhanced eyes opened, meeting hers through the glass with a clarity that broke her heart. His mouth moved again. "I love you, Mom." But now she could see the fear behind his otherworldly calm. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Manual override, backup power, something." "There is," Dr. Chen said, her voice cutting through Margaret's panic. "The transformation chambers can share power if we link them, but it requires a genetic match to establish the connection." Margaret understood immediately. To save David's life, she would have to enter an adjacent chamber and begin her own transformation. The partial genetic integration would create enough resonance to keep both systems running on minimal power. "How long would I have to stay connected?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer would be devastating. "Until full backup power is restored," Dr. Chen replied, "which could be hours or days, and once the transformation begins, interrupting it would be fatal to both subjects." Through the facility's speakers, Margaret could hear the distant sound of explosions, the federal teams blasting through security doors. They would reach this chamber within minutes, but whether they would arrive in time to prevent David's death was another question entirely. Margaret looked at her son one more time, seeing her own features reflected in his luminous face. 15 years of grief had brought her to this moment, and now she faced losing him again, this time while watching him die slowly in front of her. "Margaret!" Morrison's voice echoed through the facility's emergency communications system. "We're coming for you. Don't do anything irreversible." But Margaret was already moving toward the empty transformation chamber beside David's. Her hands found the manual controls, her scientific training guiding her through the startup sequence, even as her heart shattered. The chamber door hissed open, revealing the viscous fluid and neural connection cables that would remake her at the cellular level. One step forward would save David's life and destroy her humanity. One step back would preserve who she was while letting her son die for the second time. David's chamber alarm flatlined. His vital signs disappeared from the monitors as the life support failed completely. Margaret stepped toward the transformation chamber, but her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees as 15 years of hope died in an instant. The choice had been taken from her by timing, by technology, by the cruel mathematics of power grids and genetic compatibility. Through her tears, she could hear the federal teams breaching the outer chambers, Morrison's voice calling her name, the sound of her old life trying desperately to reach her. But David's chamber had gone dark and silent. All her choices, all her sacrifice, all her love, and she had still lost him again. Margaret knelt in the strobing emergency lights, staring at David's lifeless chamber when Tommy's small hand touched her shoulder with impossible gentleness. "Dr. Sinclair," he whispered, his child's voice carrying depths that shouldn't exist. "Look closer." Through her tears, Margaret forced herself to focus on David's motionless form. The chamber's fluid had drained completely, leaving him suspended by the neural cables like a marionette with severed strings. But as her scientist's eye adjusted to the dim emergency lighting, she noticed something that made her breath catch. David's chest was rising and falling in a rhythm too slow for human life, but too regular for death. "The transformation isn't complete," Tommy continued, "but it's advanced enough that he doesn't need the same life support as an unenhanced human. He's not dying, Dr. Sinclair. He's hibernating." Margaret pressed her face against the glass, studying her son's features with desperate intensity. The luminous quality of his skin had dimmed but not disappeared entirely. His enhanced eyes moved beneath closed lids in the same rapid patterns she'd observed earlier. "How is that possible?" she breathed. Dr. Chen appeared beside them, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where falling debris had struck her. "The enhanced physiology develops redundant systems," she explained, her clinical detachment cracking under the weight of approaching federal agents. "Slowed metabolism, improved oxygen efficiency, cellular regeneration that operates independent of external support." The sound of boots grew closer, Morrison's rescue team cutting through the facility's security barriers with mechanical precision. Margaret could hear her colleague's voice echoing down the corridors, calling her name with increasing desperation. But Tommy's next words stopped her world entirely. "Dr. Sinclair, David isn't the only one who's been waiting for you." The boy gestured toward the far wall of the chamber, where Margaret now noticed a series of smaller tanks she'd overlooked in her initial shock. As her eyes adjusted to the emergency lighting, she could make out smaller figures suspended in each one, children who appeared to be sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding them. "Every missing child from Crescent Bay for the past 30 years, Tommy said softly. "Every disappearance that was never solved, every family that was told their child had simply vanished. They're all here, Dr. Sinclair, and they're all waiting for their families to make the same choice you're facing." Margaret's legs threatened to give out entirely as the magnitude of what she was seeing crashed over her. Dozens of children, preserved in various stages of transformation, representing decades of stolen lives and grieving families. The pattern she'd been trying to uncover wasn't just about the Haddar boys. It was about a systematic harvest of human children for genetic experimentation. "You're running an adoption program for enhanced humans," she whispered, the truth finally crystallizing. "You take the children, transform them, then wait for their families to come looking. The grief drives them here eventually, and when they arrive, you offer them the same choice: transform or lose their child forever." Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "The emotional bonds create the most stable genetic matrices. Enhanced families are more successful than individual subjects. The love between parent and child provides a psychological anchor that prevents the madness that often accompanies cognitive enhancement." The federal teams were close enough now that Margaret could distinguish Morrison's voice from the others. "Margaret, we found the main chamber. Where are you?" But Margaret found herself looking not toward the approaching rescue, but toward the transformation chamber she'd almost entered. The choice that had seemed impossible moments ago now revealed itself as part of a larger, more horrifying design. "How many families have you destroyed?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as her scientific objectivity reasserted itself. "How many parents have you watched make this choice?" 73 successful family integrations over 32 years, Dr. Chen replied matter-of-factly, including the Haddars. The boys' parents completed their transformations 6 months after the children returned to town. They're currently stationed at our research facility in Alaska. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The Haddar boys hadn't returned home out of some impossible scientific accident. They'd been sent back as bait, just like David was being used as bait for her. The entire investigation, her involvement, Morrison's case, all of it had been orchestrated to bring her to this moment. She thought of her laboratory in Portland, her careful genetic research, her reputation in the scientific community. Everything that had made her valuable to these people, everything that had made her a target for recruitment rather than simply another victim. "You've been watching me," she said with sudden clarity. "My research into genetic anomalies, my work with missing children cases, my vulnerability after David's disappearance. You've been steering me toward this facility for years." Morrison's voice was almost at the chamber door now. "Margaret, the building is rigged to collapse. We need to evacuate now." Margaret stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to analyzing DNA sequences. But this choice had nothing to do with science, and everything to do with the love that had driven her across impossible boundaries. She looked at David's sleeping face one final time, then turned toward Morrison's approaching voice. "I'm coming," she called out. Behind her, Tommy's young voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "Dr. Sinclair? What about David?" Margaret paused at the chamber's entrance, her hand resting on the cold metal door frame. "David made his choice when he accepted the transformation," she said quietly. "Now I'm making mine." The chamber door slammed shut behind Margaret with a finality that echoed through the failing facility. Emergency lights cast blood-red shadows across the corridor as she stumbled toward Morrison's voice, her legs unsteady beneath the weight of her decision. Each step away from David felt like tearing away pieces of her heart, but for the first time in 15 years, her mind was crystalline clear. Margaret! Morrison appeared around a corner, his face streaked with dust and relief. Behind him came two federal agents, their tactical gear incongruous in the sterile underground facility. Thank God. We need to move. The demolition charges are on a deadman's switch. Margaret grabbed his arm, her grip fierce with sudden purpose. Morrison, listen to me carefully. This facility isn't just a research station. It's a processing center. They've been systematically harvesting children for decades, transforming them, then using them as bait to lure their families back. Margaret, we can discuss this once we're... No. Her voice cut through his protests with surgical precision. You need to understand what we're dealing with. The Haddar boys weren't rescued victims, they were recruiting tools. Every missing child case you've worked, every unsolved disappearance, this facility has been operating a pipeline of genetic experimentation using parental love as the primary control mechanism. Morrison's expression shifted from relief to horror as Margaret's words penetrated. How many children? Dozens, maybe hundreds across multiple facilities. Margaret was already thinking 3 steps ahead, her scientific training reasserting itself now that she'd stepped back from the emotional precipice. Dr. Chen mentioned an Alaska station. This is a network, Morrison, not an isolated operation. The building shuddered around them as explosions echoed from deeper in the facility. One of the federal agents spoke urgently into his radio. Alpha Team, we need immediate evacuation. Structure integrity compromised. But Margaret was already moving with renewed purpose, her grief transforming into something harder and more focused. I need to get to Chen's workstation. If we can access their database before the facility destructs, we can map their entire operation. Margaret, absolutely not. We're leaving now. She whirled to face him, and Morrison stepped back at the intensity in her eyes. David is in hibernation, not dead. The transformation process has left him in a suspended state that can potentially be reversed, but only if we understand the genetic modifications they've made. I'm not leaving without that data. The building is collapsing. Then we work fast. Margaret was already retracing her steps toward the main chamber, her 15 years of forensic experience kicking in. Crime scenes were chaos until you imposed scientific method on them. This facility was simply a crime scene on an unprecedented scale. Morrison cursed but followed her, the federal agents reluctantly maintaining their protective formation. They reached Chen's workstation just as another explosion rocked the facility, sending equipment cascading from damaged shelves. Margaret's hands flew over the keyboards, her years of genetic research allowing her to navigate the complex databases with surprising speed. Look at this, she breathed, downloading files onto a portable drive. They've been tracking genetic anomalies in missing children for 40 years. This isn't random experimentation. They're selecting for specific hereditary traits. Margaret, enhanced cognitive capacity, improved physical resilience, emotional stability markers. The data was overwhelming, but patterns were emerging that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Morrison, they're not trying to create super soldiers or genetic weapons. They're trying to create a sustainable, enhanced human population. These children aren't experiments, they're breeding stock. The implications hit her like a physical blow. David's transformation wasn't just about creating an enhanced individual, it was about establishing a genetic line that could reproduce enhanced offspring. The family units, the emotional bonds, the careful manipulation of parental love, all of it served the larger goal of creating a new subspecies of humanity. Download completed, she announced, pocketing the drive just as the lights failed entirely. Now we run. But as they turned to evacuate, Margaret caught a glimpse of something that stopped her cold. Through the chamber's viewing window, she could see David's hibernation pod, and the soft blue glow emanating from his modified neural pathways was growing brighter, not dimmer. He's responding to my presence, she whispered. Even in hibernation, the genetic resonance is activating. Morrison grabbed her arm. "Margaret, whatever you're thinking—" "I'm thinking that love is more powerful than they calculated," she said, her voice filled with fierce determination. "They designed this process to be irreversible, to force impossible choices. But they made one critical error, which is—" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the facility, her expression carrying the same cold precision she'd once applied to solving impossible cases. "They assumed I'd choose with my heart instead of my brain. But I'm not just David's mother. I'm a geneticist who now has complete access to their research data." The building groaned ominously around them, but Margaret's voice was steady as steel. "We're going to find every facility, locate every missing child, and reverse every single transformation they've performed. And then we're going to bring our children home." The emergency exit erupted in a shower of sparks as Morrison's team blasted through the final security door. Margaret clutched the data drive against her chest like a lifeline, while federal agents swept the corridor ahead of them, their tactical lights cutting through the facility's dying electrical systems. "Structural collapse imminent," one agent reported into his radio. "All teams evacuate immediately." But Margaret found herself slowing as they passed the main chamber, her eyes drawn once more to David's hibernation pod. The soft blue glow from his neural pathways pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a biological connection that transcended the cold science surrounding them. Even unconscious, even transformed, he was still reaching for her across the impossible gulf of what he'd become. "Margaret!" Morrison's voice cracked with urgency. "Move!" She forced herself forward, each step a conscious choice to trust her intellect over her maternal instincts. The data drive in her pocket contained the genetic blueprints for reversing David's transformation, but only if she lived long enough to analyze it. 15 years of grief had taught her that love without strategy was just another form of surrender. The facility's main corridor stretched ahead of them like a concrete throat, emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red shadows. Behind them, Margaret could hear the systematic destruction of evidence as automated systems purged databases and incinerated research materials. Dr. Chen and her colleagues had vanished into the facility's deeper levels, following evacuation protocols designed to protect the project's continuity above all else. "How many other facilities?" Morrison gasped as they ran, his question cutting straight to the heart of Margaret's growing dread. "The database mentioned coordinated operations across 7 states," she replied, her scientific mind already organizing the information even as her body fought for oxygen. "Alaska, Montana, Nevada, Arizona. This network has been operating for decades, Morrison. We're not dealing with a rogue research team. This is a systematic program with federal-level resources." The implications crashed over her as they reached the facility's main elevator shaft. The missing children weren't random disappearances. They were carefully selected recruits in a multi-generational project to create enhanced human bloodlines. The families who came searching were the final component, genetic matches willing to undergo transformation to maintain emotional bonds with their children. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed as the elevator carried them toward the surface. "How many families have they?" 73 successful integrations, Margaret said, repeating Dr. Chen's clinical assessment. "Hundreds of children processed through the system, and that's just from this facility." The elevator shuddered to a halt, its doors opening onto the fog-shrouded Oregon coastline. Margaret had forgotten that the world above still existed, still functioned according to normal physical laws, where children didn't hibernate in transformation chambers, and parents didn't face impossible choices between love and humanity. But as they emerged from the concealed facility entrance, Margaret realized that her old world no longer had any claim on her. The data drive in her pocket contained the genetic codes for crimes against nature on an unprecedented scale. More than that, it contained the possibility of redemption, the scientific framework for undoing what had been done to David and dozens of other children. "Where do we go from here?" Morrison asked as federal vehicles surrounded them, their headlights cutting through the coastal fog like accusatory fingers. Margaret looked back at the innocuous concrete structure that concealed the facility's entrance. In 12 hours, it would be buried under tons of earth and officially erased from existence. The children would be relocated to other facilities. The research would continue. The families would keep coming, driven by the same desperate love that had brought her here. "We follow the data," she said, her voice carrying the same methodical determination that had made her career in forensic genetics. "Every facility, every missing child, every family that's been destroyed by this program. We map the entire network and then we dismantle it piece by piece." Morrison studied her face in the harsh glare of the federal vehicles. "Margaret, you realize what you're proposing? Taking on a program with this level of resources and organization? They'll come after you. They'll come after everyone you care about." Margaret thought of David's glowing eyes meeting hers through the chamber glass, of Tommy's impossible wisdom, of the dozens of sleeping children suspended in transformation tanks, waiting for families who might never find them. The weight of their stolen lives settled on her shoulders like a mantle she couldn't remove. "They already took the person I cared about most," she said quietly. "Now they've given me the tools to take him back." The facility's entrance sealed itself with mechanical finality, disappearing beneath carefully camouflaged earth. But Margaret could still feel David's presence, calling to her across impossible distances through genetic bonds that transcended normal human biology. She climbed into Morrison's vehicle, her hand never leaving the data drive that contained their war plans. The real battle was just beginning. The war room Morrison arranged in the Portland FBI field office felt like a command center for an impossible campaign. Fluorescent lights hummed over tables covered with printouts, genetic analyses, and satellite photographs of suspected facility locations. Margaret stood at the center of it all, her 15 years of forensic experience finally channeled toward a purpose that transcended any case she'd ever worked. "The Alaska facility is operational," she announced, pointing to a cluster of photographs showing an isolated research compound. "Thermal imaging confirms active power consumption consistent with hibernation chambers. Based on the data from Oregon, I estimate they're housing 40 to 50 subjects." Agent Sarah Collins, Morrison's federal liaison, leaned forward. "Subjects or victims?" "Both." Margaret's voice carried the clinical precision she'd developed to protect herself from the emotional weight of what they were discovering. "The transformation process creates enhanced individuals with capabilities beyond normal human parameters. But they're still the children who were taken from their families, genetically modified but psychologically intact." 6 weeks had passed since the Oregon facility's destruction. 6 weeks of sleepless nights analyzing Dr. Chen's stolen data, mapping genetic markers, and building profiles of a network that stretched back 40 years. Margaret's Portland laboratory had become a fortress of scientific investigation, every surface covered with evidence of systematic crimes against humanity. "The Nevada site went dark 3 days ago," Morrison reported, consulting his latest intelligence briefing. "They're accelerating the timeline, moving subjects, purging databases, eliminating evidence." Margaret felt the familiar surge of urgency that had driven her since that night in the underground chamber. Every day of delay meant more children relocated beyond their reach, more families separated by impossible distances. But rushing had already cost them the Montana facility. Federal agents had found only empty chambers and sanitized equipment when they'd moved too quickly. "We need to hit all remaining sites simultaneously," she said, her finger tracing connections between facility locations on the wall map. "Coordinated strikes within a 12-hour window to prevent evacuations." Collins shook her head. "Margaret, you're talking about a military operation against American research facilities. Even with the evidence you've provided, the legal justification..." "Legal justification?" Margaret's control cracked slightly, revealing the grief and fury she'd been channeling into scientific methodology. "They've stolen hundreds of children, Agent Collins. They've destroyed families across 7 states. They offered to transform me into something inhuman just to maintain their emotional control over my son." The room fell silent. Morrison had briefed his federal contacts on Margaret's experience in the Oregon facility, but hearing her describe it firsthand carried a weight that clinical reports couldn't convey. Margaret forced herself to continue with professional calm. The genetic modifications are reversible, but only within specific timeframes. The longer these children remain in transformation states, the more their original neural pathways deteriorate. We're not just racing against evidence destruction, we're racing against permanent psychological damage. She pulled up a holographic display of genetic sequences, the same type of analysis that had made her reputation in forensic science. Look at these markers. The enhanced cognitive functions come at the cost of normal emotional development. After 18 months in hibernation, the children lose the ability to form natural human attachments. They become functionally sociopathic. Enhanced but not human, Collins murmured, understanding finally dawning in her expression. Exactly. The project's ultimate goal isn't creating super soldiers or genetic weapons. They're developing a replacement species, cognitively superior but emotionally controlled. The Family Integration Program ensures genetic compatibility while eliminating the unpredictable elements that make humanity human. Margaret moved to another display showing facility floor plans reconstructed from the Oregon data. David has been in hibernation for 7 weeks. According to their research protocols, I have approximately 10 months before the modifications become irreversible. Morrison studied her face with concern that went beyond their professional relationship. Margaret, you can't take this personally. We'll find him, but I'm not taking it personally, Morrison. I'm taking it scientifically. Her voice carried the same cold determination that had once made her the most feared forensic geneticist in the Pacific Northwest. Every child in their system represents a genetic puzzle that can be solved. Every facility contains data that brings us closer to understanding the reversal process. Every day we delay, those puzzles become unsolvable. She turned to address the entire room, her presence commanding attention with an authority earned through decades of impossible cases. I've identified the primary research facility, Phoenix, Arizona. Underground complex, maximum security, housing the project's original genetic templates. If we can capture that site intact, we can map the reversal protocols for every child they've taken. And if we can't? Collins asked. Margaret's smile held no warmth, only scientific certainty. Then we create our own protocols. I've spent 6 weeks analyzing their enhancement techniques. I know how they modified these children's genetics. With enough time and resources, I can unmake what they've done. The room erupted in tactical planning, logistics, legal frameworks, operational timelines. But Margaret stood apart from the chaos, her mind already 3 moves ahead. The Phoenix facility wasn't just their final target, it was David's best chance of coming home as himself. The ultimate test was beginning. Margaret stared at the satellite feed of the Phoenix facility, her hands steady despite the caffeine tremor that had plagued her for weeks. The underground complex sprawled beneath an innocuous industrial park like a technological tumor, its heat signatures revealing the location of every hibernation chamber, every research laboratory, every corridor that might lead to David. Final approach in 15 minutes, Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. 3 simultaneous raids across 2 time zones, coordinated down to the second, Alaska, Nevada, and Arizona. One chance to capture the network before it vanished forever into bureaucratic shadows. The tactical van shuddered as it descended the service ramp into the facility's parking garage. Margaret felt her pulse synchronize with the rhythm of her breathing, the same methodical calm she'd cultivated during 15 years of crime scene analysis. But this wasn't just another case. This was the culmination of every impossible choice she'd made since that November morning in Crescent Bay. Movement on Sublevel 3. Agent Collins reported from her monitoring station. They know we're here. Through the facility's compromised security feeds, Margaret watched Dr. Chen moving between hibernation chambers with clinical efficiency, not evacuating, Completing final procedures, the transformation process accelerated beyond safe parameters, permanent modifications implemented in minutes rather than months. "They're trying to finalize the children before we can stop them," Margaret breathed, her scientific mind processing the implications even as maternal terror threatened to overwhelm her objectivity. "Morrison, we have to reach the main laboratory now." The facility's blast doors erupted inward under federal charges, filling the sterile corridors with concrete dust and the acrid smell of high explosives. Margaret followed the tactical team through smoke that reminded her of the Oregon facility's destruction, her mind cataloging every detail that might prove crucial for reversing whatever they found. The main laboratory opened before them like a cathedral of perverted science. Dozens of hibernation chambers stretched in perfect rows, each one containing a child suspended in transformation sleep. Blue neural lighting pulsed through the darkness, creating patterns that looked almost like breathing. And there, in the chamber closest to Dr. Chen's monitoring station, Margaret found David. He hung motionless in the preservation fluid, his 12-year-old body unchanged since the day he'd disappeared. But the soft glow emanating from his neural pathways had intensified, creating fractal patterns of light that mapped the enhanced cognitive structures growing through his brain tissue. Beautiful and terrible, like watching evolution accelerated beyond natural limits. "Dr. Sinclair," Chen's voice carried across the laboratory with the same clinical detachment Margaret remembered from their previous encounter. "You've arrived just as we complete the final integration protocols. How remarkably efficient." Margaret stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to the data drive that contained 6 weeks of genetic analysis. Every enhancement pathway, every modification sequence, every theoretical approach to reversing what they'd done to these children. "It's over, Chen. We have your research data. We know how to undo the transformations." Chen's smile held genuine amusement. "Do you? Tell me, Dr. Sinclair. Which version of David are you planning to restore? The frightened 12-year-old who ran into the woods, or the enhanced individual he's becoming? Because the modification process doesn't simply add capabilities, it fundamentally rewrites the neurological structures that create personality, memory, emotional response. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, challenging everything she'd assumed about the reversibility of the genetic changes. "You're lying." "I'm being scientific." Chen gestured toward David's chamber, where the neural lighting had begun pulsing in complex rhythms. "The child you remember ceased to exist weeks ago. What remains is genetically compatible, but psychologically transformed. Cognitive enhancement requires the elimination of inefficient emotional patterns. Fear, attachment dependency, irrational love responses." Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture. 6 weeks of analysis, 6 weeks of building theoretical reversal protocols, 6 weeks of believing that love and science could combine to bring her son home unchanged. But Chen's research data had never included personality preservation, only genetic modification and physical enhancement. "However," Chen continued, her voice carrying the tone of someone offering a final gift, "the integration process remains incomplete. David's transformation can still be guided rather than simply executed. You could join him, Dr. Sinclair, undergo the same modifications, experience the same enhancement, maintain your relationship while transcending the limitations of unmodified humanity." The chamber around David pulsed brighter, responding to Margaret's proximity with the same genetic resonance she'd witnessed in Oregon. Even transformed, even enhanced beyond normal human parameters, he was still reaching for her across the impossible gulf of what he'd become. Margaret's hand tightened around the data drive that represented her only hope of scientific reversal. Behind her, Morrison and his team waited for orders, their weapons trained on Dr. Chen and her assistants. Around them, dozens of children hung in transformation sleep, their families' love weaponized against humanity's future. The ultimate choice crystallized in Margaret's mind with terrible clarity. Accept the enhancement and preserve their relationship in a transformed state. risk the reversal process and potentially destroy David's personality forever, or walk away and leave him suspended between human and post-human, belonging fully to neither. Margaret Sinclair, forensic geneticist and grieving mother, faced the deepest fear that had driven her for 15 years, that love might not be enough to bridge the distance between who they were and who they'd become. The weight of impossible choice pressed against Margaret's chest like a physical force. Through David's chamber glass, she could see the neural pathways pulsing with enhanced cognition that would make him brilliant and potentially strip away everything that made him her son. The data drive in her pocket contained 6 weeks of meticulous analysis, but Chen's revelation had shattered her confidence in the reversal process. "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before the integration becomes irreversible?" Chen consulted her monitoring displays with clinical precision. "Approximately 40 minutes. After that point, any attempt to restore his original neural patterns will result in complete cognitive collapse." Margaret stepped closer to David's chamber, her reflection wavering in the preservation fluid like a ghost of the mother she'd been 15 years ago. His face remained peacefully unchanged, the same 12-year-old features she'd memorized during countless sleepless nights. But the patterns of light threading through his brain tissue told a different story. Enhanced intelligence growing at the cost of natural human emotion. "The other children," she said, forcing herself to think beyond her personal loss. "How many can still be reversed?" 14 are beyond the critical threshold, Chen replied matter-of-factly. 23 remain within the reversible window. The Haddar brothers you encountered in Oregon have been successfully restored to baseline human genetics at our Alaska facility. The news hit Margaret like a revelation. Tommy, Michael, and David Haddar, the impossible children who'd walked out of the woods unchanged, had been returned to their families. The process worked, but it required sacrifice at a scale that made her stomach clench with dread. Morrison approached carefully, reading the devastation in her posture. "Margaret, what aren't you telling us?" She pulled the data drive from her pocket, studying it as if it might reveal answers she'd missed during weeks of analysis. The reversal process requires a genetic template, an unmodified DNA sample to guide the restoration. For children who've been missing for years, those samples don't exist anymore. Environmental degradation, cellular breakdown. What are you saying? Margaret's hand pressed against David's chamber, feeling the vibrations from the transformation apparatus. "To save these children, I need to provide a living genetic baseline, a parent's DNA actively donated during the reversal process. The template degrades during use. One parent, one child." The laboratory fell silent except for the rhythmic humming of hibernation chambers. Morrison's tactical team exchanged glances that reflected the impossible mathematics of salvation. 47 modified children, and perhaps 20 living parents who might be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for their recovery. "Dr. Sinclair." Chen's voice carried something that might have been respect. "You understand the implications of your analysis. Saving these children will cost the lives of their parents. Most families won't accept that exchange." Margaret thought of every grieving parent she'd encountered during her forensic career. Parents who would have gladly traded their lives for one more day with their lost children. Parents who'd spent years carrying guilt and desperate hope in equal measure. Parents like herself, who'd shaped their entire existence around the absence of someone they loved. "But some will," she said quietly. She turned to face Morrison, her expression carrying the same determined calm that had sustained her through 15 years of impossible cases. "Contact every family on Chen's list. Explain the choice. Explain the cost. Let them decide." "Margaret, this isn't about me anymore, Morrison. It's about giving these families the option to choose sacrifice over loss, the option to transform their grief into something meaningful." She looked back at David's chamber, where the neural enhancement patterns continued their relentless growth. In 40 minutes, the choice would be taken from her forever. Her brilliant, cognitively superior son would wake up functionally incapable of loving her the way she remembered. "I need the laboratory's genetic sequencer," she told Chen, "and access to the reversal protocols." Chen's eyebrows raised with genuine surprise. "Dr. Sinclair, you're proposing to sacrifice yourself for a child who may not remember loving you afterward. I'm proposing to give him the chance to choose who he wants to become." Margaret moved toward the laboratory equipment with the focused efficiency of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. The reversal process restores original neural patterns, but it doesn't erase the memories formed during enhancement. He'll remember both versions of himself and decide which one represents who he really is. Morrison grabbed her arm gently. "There has to be another way." Margaret smiled with something that might have been peace. "There is. We can walk away. Let David and 23 other children wake up as enhanced post-human individuals. Watch them build relationships with families they can't emotionally connect to. Watch them become brilliant, capable, and fundamentally lonely." She pulled free of Morrison's grip and began initializing the genetic sequencer. "Or we can give them back the capacity for irrational, inefficient, beautifully human love. The choice isn't whether to sacrifice. It's whether the sacrifice serves love or abandonment." The laboratory equipment hummed to life around them as Margaret Sinclair prepared to trade her life for her son's humanity. The cost of victory had finally been revealed, and she accepted it with scientific precision and maternal certainty. The genetic sequencer's initialization sequence cast pale blue light across Margaret's face as she methodically entered the reversal parameters. Each keystroke felt deliberate, final, the culmination of 15 years spent navigating the intersection between scientific objectivity and parental love. Behind her, Morrison coordinated with the other raid teams through his earpiece, his voice carefully neutral as he relayed instructions that would change dozens of families forever. "Alaska team reports successful reversal of the Haddar boys," he announced quietly. "The process worked exactly as your data predicted." Margaret nodded without looking away from the sequencer's display. The genetic cascade required precise timing. Her DNA would provide the template for David's restoration, but the metabolic cost would drain her cellular structure beyond recovery. A perfect exchange, one life fully lived for another, returned to the possibility of living authentically. Dr. Chen moved to a monitoring station with surprising cooperation, her scientific curiosity apparently overriding any loyalty to the project's goals. "The neural integration patterns are accelerating," she observed clinically. "Your son's enhancement is reaching critical mass ahead of schedule." Through David's chamber glass, Margaret could see the intensification Chen described. The neural pathways pulsed with increasing complexity, creating fractal patterns of light that mapped cognitive abilities far beyond normal human parameters. Beautiful and terrifying, the visualization of her child transforming into something that might no longer need her love. 32 minutes, Chen continued. "After that, his enhanced neural architecture will be permanent." Margaret's hands moved across the sequencer controls with practiced efficiency, calibrating the genetic template that would guide David's restoration. The science was elegant in its simplicity. Her unmodified DNA would serve as a blueprint for reversing every genetic modification, every cognitive enhancement, every change that separated her son from his original self. Margaret Morrison's voice carried the weight of someone watching a friend make an irreversible choice. 7 families have agreed to the exchange. Their children can be saved. You don't have to— "Yes, I do." She turned to face him, her expression carrying the same calm determination that had sustained her through decades of forensic work. David was the first child taken by this project. His genetic profile provided the baseline for every subsequent modification. If we can reverse his transformation completely, we'll have the template for reversing all of them. The truth settled over the laboratory like a revelation. Morrison's tactical team exchanged glances that reflected the magnitude of what Margaret was proposing, not just saving her own son, but creating the scientific foundation for rescuing every child in the network. "One reversal to save 47 children," Chen murmured. her scientific mind clearly processing the elegant mathematics of Margaret's sacrifice. "Dr. Sinclair, your analytical approach is remarkably efficient." Margaret smiled with something approaching peace. Efficiency was never the goal. Understanding was. She moved to David's chamber and pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the vibrations from the transformation apparatus. 15 years of grief, 15 years of guilt, 15 years of carrying the weight of his disappearance, all of it crystallizing into this single moment of choice between who he had been and who he might become. "The process will preserve his memories of the enhancement period," she told Morrison quietly. "He'll remember both versions of himself. The frightened 12-year-old who ran into the woods and the cognitively superior individual he's becoming. The choice of which version represents his true self will be his to make." Morrison nodded, understanding finally dawning in his expression. Margaret wasn't just reversing David's genetic modifications. She was giving him the agency to choose his own identity, armed with the full knowledge of both possibilities. The sequencer completed its calibration with a soft chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the sterile laboratory. Margaret looked at the readout displaying her genetic template, mapped in precise detail that would guide her son's restoration at the cost of her own cellular structure. "Dr. Chen," she said formally, "please initiate David's chamber for emergency reversal." Chen's hands moved across her controls with the same clinical precision Margaret remembered from their first encounter. But now that precision served recovery rather than modification, restoration rather than enhancement. The laboratory's atmosphere shifted as hibernation systems began the delicate process of bringing David toward consciousness. "Reversal sequence initialized," Chen announced. "Template integration beginning in 60 seconds. Margaret stepped closer to the genetic sequencer, her hand resting on the activation control. Around them, Morrison's team prepared to implement the same reversal process for the 6 other children, whose parents had chosen sacrifice over loss. The mathematics of love made tangible through scientific precision. In the chamber, David's eyes began to flutter beneath closed lids, the first sign of returning consciousness after weeks of transformation sleep. Margaret watched her son's face with the intensity of someone memorizing details for a final time, storing every feature against the possibility that love might survive the fundamental changes they were about to implement. The cost of victory had been calculated with scientific accuracy. Margaret Sinclair, forensic geneticist and grieving mother, prepared to discover whether the deepest forms of human connection could transcend the boundaries between sacrifice and salvation. The reversal process began with a sound like crystalline structures realigning at the molecular level. Margaret felt the genetic sequencer drawing from her cellular matrix, each pulse extracting portions of her unmodified DNA to guide David's restoration. The sensation wasn't painful, more like watching pieces of herself dissolve into light that flowed toward her son's chamber through fiber optic conduits. "Template integration at 15%, Chen announced, her voice carrying the detached precision of someone documenting a historic moment. Subjects' enhanced neural pathways responding to baseline restoration. Through the chamber glass, Margaret watched the complex patterns of light in David's brain tissue begin to simplify. The fractal networks of cognitive enhancement slowly unraveled, replaced by the more chaotic but fundamentally human neural architecture she remembered from his childhood medical scans. Each pulse of the sequencer restored another fragment of who he had been, while drawing away another fragment of who she was. Morrison stood beside her, his presence steady and supportive as Margaret's legs began trembling with the metabolic cost of the procedure. "The other teams are ready to implement the process," he said quietly. 7 children across the network will be home by morning." Margaret nodded, watching David's face as consciousness slowly returned to features that remained unchanged despite everything he'd endured. 12 years old, exactly as he'd been the day he disappeared into the Oregon woods, but his eyes, when they finally opened, carried depths that spoke of experiences far beyond his apparent age. "Mom?" His voice was tentative, uncertain, not the enhanced clarity Chen had predicted, but the familiar hesitation of a child trying to reconcile impossible memories. "I'm here." Margaret pressed her palm against the chamber glass, feeling the vibrations of the hibernation system powering down. "I'm right here." David's eyes focused on her with increasing clarity, and Margaret saw the moment when his restored memories aligned with his original personality. Confusion flickered across his features as he processed weeks of cognitive enhancement alongside 12 years of normal human emotion. The child who had run into the woods and the post-human individual he had briefly become, existing simultaneously in the same consciousness. "I remember everything," he whispered, "being scared in the woods, the laboratory, thinking differently, but also thinking like myself." His hand moved to mirror hers against the glass. "Why do I feel like I've been dreaming?" "Because in a way, you have been." Margaret's voice remained steady despite the weakness spreading through her limbs as the sequencer completed its extraction. "The question now is who you choose to be when you're fully awake." The chamber began its final deactivation sequence, preservation fluid draining away as David's restored physiology prepared for normal atmospheric conditions. Chen monitored the process with professional fascination, documenting the first successful reversal of genetic modifications that had been considered irreversible. "Neural integration complete," Chen announced. "Subject demonstrates full restoration of baseline human cognitive patterns while retaining memory fragments from the enhancement period. Dr. Sinclair, your theoretical framework was remarkably accurate." Margaret smiled, feeling strangely peaceful as her cellular structure continued breaking down in service of David's restoration. She had solved the case that had defined her career, not through detached analysis, but through the willing sacrifice of a mother who understood that love sometimes required the ultimate form of letting go. The chamber door cycled open with a soft hiss, and David stepped out on unsteady legs that remembered being 12 years old rather than post-human enhanced. He moved toward Margaret with the careful deliberation of someone testing the boundaries of their own identity, his expression mixing childhood vulnerability with hard-won wisdom. "The enhancement made me smarter," he said quietly, studying her face with eyes that held both versions of himself. "But it also made me empty, like I could understand everything except why any of it mattered." Margaret reached for him as Morrison steadied her weakening form. "And now?" David's arms wrapped around her with the desperate intensity of a child who had been lost and found himself home. "Now I remember why thinking matters, because it helps us love each other better." The reunion felt both miraculous and perfectly natural, a mother and son reconnecting across an impossible gulf of time, enhancement, and sacrifice. Around them, similar scenes played out through communication channels as other families across the network experienced their own restorations, their own choices between who their children had been and who they might become. "The other children?" David asked, his voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. "The ones who were enhanced with me, will they be okay?" "They'll have the same choice you did," Margaret assured him, feeling the profound satisfaction of a case finally closed. Their families are giving them the chance to remember who they were before deciding who they want to be. Dr. Chen approached with something resembling respect in her clinical demeanor. "Dr. Sinclair, your sacrifice has provided the template for reversing 47 genetic modifications. From a purely scientific perspective, your methodology was elegant." Margaret looked at her son, 12 years old, fully human, and armed with memories that would help him appreciate both the gifts and limitations of unenhanced consciousness. The cost had been calculated with scientific precision, but the result transcended any equation she might have written. Understanding, she said simply, was always the point. 6 months later, Margaret Sinclair sat in the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window of their small house outside Portland, watching David methodically work through algebra problems at the dining table. His pencil moved with the careful precision of someone who remembered solving far more complex equations with enhanced cognitive abilities, but chose the slower satisfaction of learning at human pace. "This one's frustrating," he said, erasing a calculation for the third time. "I can almost remember the shortcut, but it feels like cheating." Margaret smiled over her coffee cup, marveling at how completely he had embraced the limitations that made him authentically himself. The doctors had warned that children who underwent reversal might struggle with the contrast between their enhanced and restored capabilities. David seemed to find relief in the struggle, proof that his thoughts and feelings belonged entirely to him. "Shortcuts aren't always better," she said. "Sometimes the longer path teaches you things you need to know." Outside, Morrison's car pulled into their driveway. His monthly visits had become routine, part official follow-up, part personal friendship forged through shared experience. Margaret's cellular regeneration therapy had stabilized her condition, though she would never fully recover from the metabolic cost of David's restoration. Some prices, she had learned, were worth paying incompletely. "Agent Morrison's here," David announced, his face brightening with genuine affection. The boy, who remembered both enhanced isolation and human connection, had become remarkably adept at appreciating the people who chose to be present in his life. Morrison entered carrying a folder that had become familiar, updates on the other 46 children recovered from the enhancement network. Each monthly report detailed their progress, their choices, their slow integration into families that had been fundamentally changed by the experience of loss and recovery. "Good news from Alaska," Morrison said, settling into his usual chair. "The Haddar boys are doing well." James decided to skip ahead 2 grade levels. Apparently he retained enough enhancement to make normal coursework boring, but he's also joined the school's art program. Says drawing helps him remember what it feels like to create something just because it's beautiful. Margaret nodded, filing away another small victory in the ongoing case study of children choosing their own identities. The scientific community had been both fascinated and disturbed by the reversal data. Several researchers had approached her about publishing comprehensive findings, but Margaret had declined. Some knowledge, she believed, was too dangerous to disseminate widely. "What about the Chen facility?" David asked, with the mature concern of someone who understood the broader implications of his own experience. "Completely decommissioned," Morrison replied. "Chen herself is serving 15 years for unauthorized human experimentation. The Federal Oversight Committee has implemented new protocols to prevent similar research from developing unmonitored." Margaret traced patterns in the condensation on her coffee cup, thinking about the thin line between scientific advancement and ethical catastrophe. Her forensic work had taught her to examine evidence objectively, but this case had shown her the equal importance of examining the human cost of knowledge. Some boundaries existed for profound reasons. David closed his algebra book with the satisfied finality of someone who had earned his understanding through effort rather than enhancement. "I've been thinking about what I want to do," he said, his tone carrying the careful consideration of someone who had experienced multiple versions of intellectual capability. "I want to study genetics, but not to change people, to understand what makes us human in the first place." The declaration didn't surprise Margaret. David's unique perspective, remembering both enhanced and natural consciousness, had given him insights into identity and humanity that few people could claim. He approached the subject with reverence rather than ambition, understanding both the power and responsibility that came with genetic knowledge. "That sounds like exactly the right reason," Morrison said approvingly. Margaret looked at her son, studying the determined expression that reminded her of the 12-year-old who had once run into the Oregon woods to escape something he couldn't understand. That frightened child had been transformed, lost, and ultimately restored, but the experience had left him with wisdom that transcended his chronological age. He would grow up knowing firsthand the value of human limitation, the beauty of imperfection, the irreplaceable worth of authentic emotion. The afternoon light shifted across their small kitchen table as Margaret contemplated the resolution of the case that had defined both their lives. The missing children had been found, the enhancement network dismantled, the families given choices they never thought possible. But the real victory wasn't in the scientific breakthrough or the successful prosecutions. It was in the quiet moment of watching her son struggle with algebra and choose to find joy in the struggle itself. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand, his touch carrying all the warmth and connection that enhancement had temporarily stolen from him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for bringing me home." Margaret squeezed back, feeling the profound satisfaction of understanding finally achieved, not through analysis or investigation, but through the recognition that some things were worth preserving at any cost. Love, she had learned, was the most human thing of all. The case was closed. The family was whole. The future stretched ahead with all its beautiful, imperfect, authentically human possibilities.